Greetings, everyone. I'd like to introduce you to a game by Starny Games. I wouldn't really consider it a game. I'd consider it a storytelling kind of thing. I really don't know how to put it. But this thing is called Ukraine War Stories. Now, like me, we have all played first-person shooters. We've all been on the digital battlefield, running through trenches, homes, buildings, streets, stuff like that. You know, we see the horrors in the digital battlefield, quote unquote, the horrors of war in the digital battlefield, but we never get to see or experience the civilian aspect of it. What the civilians go through, what the normal everyday person goes through. And with this, we can kind of experience. Now from this has been taken, many of the stories in here have been taken from actual accounts from Ukraine. And yeah, let's dive into it. Our first story will be Hostomel. Evening in February. It was barely past 1700, but it was getting dark already. Spring was on its way in, but we were still getting early sunsets and cold nights. Another quiet evening in the house that was entirely too big for just me and my Lilia. Ever since our daughter had settled in Kyiv, no surprises there. Hostomel has always been too small for her. Still, she kept in touch with us. In fact, that evening, I was just trying to figure out a present from her, a smartphone. Well, I wasn't trying anymore. I delegated the task to the neighbor's girl, Lena's Mizorvin. Milena is a bright girl, top of her class at the medical university in Kyiv. Much younger than my own daughter, Katya. Barely in her 20s, quick-witted and full of life, unlike me, a tired old man. I've been an aviation engineer for 40 years before retiring. And yet, these modern gadgets are beyond anything I've worked with. Now my wife Lilia, she is the savvy one. But that evening, she was preoccupied. Alexei, she said in a worried voice. Alexei, have you heard that what Putin is saying? He recognized those republics in Donbass. She clutched her chest. Oh God, the Russians are going to invade. I looked over to see her watching a Russian broadcast on YouTube, and I could only roll my eyes. For the last few weeks, what Putin was saying was everyone's favorite gossip. That a big war was coming, that the Russians were finally going to invade in full force. That's why Milena left Kiev a day ago and came to join her parents in Hostomel. Many people fled the capital in the last few days, as it was if everybody expected Kiev to be bombed off the face of the earth. Lily, please, nothing's gonna happen, I said, when I caught Milena's glance. She was afraid too. Mr. Borisov, they got so many troops on our borders. They wouldn't keep them there if they were just bluffing. That's exactly how a bluff works, child, I chuckled. We have nothing to fear because now we're given some choices. We can pick the right time for attack has passed, Putin will try to annex Donbass at most. If Putin invades, the UN will eat him alive. And he doesn't have nearly enough forces. If Putin invades, the UN will eat him alive. Sanctions, sanctions. Last time the Russians invaded, the UN put sanctions on them. If Putin invades now, the new sanctions will do him in. I tried giving the girls a reassuring smile. In retrospect, it may have looked a little smug. You know, at least I took first aid courses. And stocked us up on some gauze. That'll be useful, right, darling? She looked at Milena, who replied with enthusiastic nodding. You could have done something useful as well instead of buying more model planes. I just chuckled. I could tell she was just worried. She didn't mean it one bit. Look, if you're so worried, I'll go get the car fueled up, say on Thursday. We weren't using our car much, except to buy groceries, so the near empty tank didn't seem like an issue. With my bum leg, I barely left home anyway, and Lilia worked as a teacher. Her students were all on distance learning. And we'll go have a vacation in the Carpathians. A week? No, 2 weeks. Until this whole deal resolves itself, and you'll see what I was right. Stocking up fuel is a good idea, Elena chimed in. My dad is stocking up as well, before the prices rise even more. I nodded. I didn't believe war was coming, and if I did, could I do anything to prevent it? But there is something I could do. Help everyone stay calm. Milena mood 1, 2. Lilia's mood 1, 2. First day of war. There was a deafening noise outside, wresting me from sleep instantly. At first, I didn't believe my own ears. I thought I hadn't woken up at all. And this was all a nightmare. But then I heard the noise again. Explosions. Oh God, Lyusha. They're bombing the airfield. Look, these helicopters are shooting rockets. I looked around and saw my wife. She was already running towards the window. Did she hear it first? She was always the quicker thinker between us two. After a night of sleep, stepping on my bum leg felt worse than usual. I limped towards Lily and looked into the window. I didn't have the eyesight to make out the details, but I saw helicopters swarming over Hostomel airfield, launching bright flares all around them. Not rockets, flares. They do it so our soldiers don't shoot them down. They're fixing to deploy the airborne troops. Lily covered her mouth with her hands and looked at me. I don't think I've ever seen her so confused and scared. Pack our things. We might have to leave town. My wife ran around the house packing up everything of any value. I was trying to process what was happening. The war had begun. I had seen it with my own eyes, but I still couldn't comprehend it. I was so convinced that the Russians would never act upon their threats. What a fool I've been. There was gunfire coming from the airfield. It snapped me back to reality. I had to do something. I went back to check on Lily. I saw her hands were shaking. I had to calm her down, or at least make sure she didn't forget to pack anything important. On the other hand, I never got around to refueling our car, and only had enough petrol to drive to the nearest refueling station. And now we're giving some options again. We can help Lily pack up. We can ask our neighbors for gasoline. Or we can comfort Lily. Now personally, if I saw my wife scared, I'd want to comfort her or help her pack up. But seeing the situation, I want to ask my neighbors for gasoline so maybe we can all escape. So we're gonna go ask our neighbors for gasoline. Getting gasoline was my first priority. I got dressed, told Lily where I was going, and went to visit our closest neighbors. I knocked on the door, then called out a few times. Nothing. I swore silently and limped towards the next house. About an hour, I'd visited all the neighbors. Most of them had left town, while others were packing up or waiting for their relatives to join them. They all told me to evacuate as far as possible. Some were abroad, or at least to the western part of Ukraine. The Russians weren't going to get that far, they said. Naturally, nobody had any gasoline to spare. I was heading home when someone called out my name. It was David Morazian. The neighbor whose house I had visited first. He just came back home after stocking up at one of the grocery stores he owned in town. Good day, Oleski. Have you seen how our boys kicked those Ruskies out to the curb? He was merry and excited. Must have been the nerves, I thought, while David kept talking. The Russian landed their airborne and left. Can you imagine? Just left our troops to fend for themselves. Our boys destroyed them on the ground. I wasn't convinced. It sounded too good to be true. To snap David back to reality, I asked him about gasoline. Oh, of course. Here you go. He got a jerry can out of his car's trunk and gave it to me. But if I were you, I would stay put. They say the Russians who survived scattering into the woods. Personally, I let our boys smoke them out first. He smiled. David bid me farewell and went home to reassure his wife, who seemed to be scared, same as Lily was. In me, I believed him, and I stayed put. If I'm being honest, I just wanted to believe that it would all sort itself out in a couple of days. I will never forgive myself for not getting Lily out of Hostomel on the same day. Let's get smooth. 3, 2, fuel, 0, +1. I believe. Esky, what will we do? Lilia complained, stifling away the last of her tears. Did you hear it? Did you hear how loud it was? How terrible. Nodded and hugged Lilia close. I sure heard it. Around 3 a.m. when we were sleeping in the basement. A shell hit our house. I don't know what it was, but it shook the whole place. I was crawling around looking for my cane, wondering if we should stay put or run. While Lilia was covering her ears and screaming, then, when we were sure the walls weren't tumbling down on us, she started crying. This would have all been over soon, I hope, but at the time, all I could do was hold her close. The next morning, when the fighting had quieted down, I heard a knock on our basement door. Our neighbors came to visit us, the whole Morizan family, Milena and her parents. Oliski, Lilia, David, the father of the family, walked up to me and firmly shook my hand. How are you two doing? Are you all right? We saw your house get hit. Thank the Almighty you weren't there. No kidding, I sighed. We have to leave, David. This is getting too dangerous. David's wife Vola chimed in. We can't leave, Oleski Fyodorovich. We've spoken with the Territorial Defense Office. They said it's too dangerous. They're already talking about Russians shooting at cars. I wanted to curse. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sure, the war had been going on for 8 years now, but it was in the Donbass, on the edge of our country. Now the Russians were taking their planes and tanks and bombs all the way up to Kyiv. I shook my head. Tell me, did they take their Antonov airport? If they did, the road to Kiev would be wide open. We'd be seeing thousands, if not tens of thousands of men and vehicles rolling out in the next few days. No, my friend, they didn't. It's quite a story, really, David said, and motioned for his wife and daughter to carry on without him. They brought us some supplies and took them downstairs. David, meanwhile, told me the news. They had yet to make it to the TV, but the gossip had already spread around town. The Russians took the Antonov airport, but it's all shelled to bits, unusable. They won't be landing anything there or using it for our planes. Or using any of our planes. I gasped and David cut himself off. He didn't need to continue. Here too? It's gone? I worked at the Antonov Design Bureau for 40 years. Aviation was my life. Still is. However, little of that life is left in me. And nothing the Antonov Bureau ever made came close to the AN-225 Mira. The biggest cargo plane ever designed. A marvel of engineering. Soviet, Ukrainian, it didn't matter. Mira was a treasure. I thought it was terrible waste that it was barely flown in our 3 decades of independence. But that day, I learned of a truly terrible waste. I felt a sting in my chest and clutched at it. David quickly rushed to support me. He helped me sit down on the ground. I couldn't talk at first, so he continued. What a rotten world, huh? I told my girl to wait out the war in Hostomel if it came, and now the war has come here. He reached into his jacket inner pocket, and before I knew it, there was a bottle in his hand. I was appalled at first, drinking at a time like this, but David kept talking. Nothing is sacred to these Russians. Destroying Mira is bad enough, but you know what they do to women? If the Russians get here, if they do, I can't calm my girls down, and I can't protect them either. I don't even have a gun. He reached to uncork the bottle, drawing my attention to it. It was the finest Armenian cognac money could buy. We have 3 options here. Fine, let's go to your place though. Save the bottle for a better time. Maybe let's gather everyone for a drink. We'll save the bottle for a better time. Mira was a terrible loss. I didn't know what to think about it. But drowning my sorrow in alcohol was not an option. If David was so sure the war could only last a few days, I said surely that his cognac was better spent celebrating victory. David frowned, but I had to agree. He even told me to keep the bottle. That way, he'd be sure it survived until our victory. I mean, yeah. Wasn't wrong there. I barely drank, and he never kept any alcohol at home. So when I came to the basement to stash the bottle, Lilia had some questions. It's a gift from David Mizrom. He said, "We'll open it when it's time to celebrate our victory," I said. I didn't tell her about Miria. Lily gave me a sideways look, but soon realized I was being honest. She smiled. "That's a wonderful idea. Give him my thanks." The day drew to a close, and for me and David were parting ways just before the curfew. Shots were already ringing out somewhere far. The night, like the ones before it, was going to get loud. Suddenly, we heard the sound of approaching vehicles. "What do you know? Our armed forces have finally arrived," David asked, and looked out onto this road. Then his face dropped. As the armored vehicles rolled down the road, we could see the bright white Z's painted on them. Alcohol is still 0 over the 1. David's mood is 2 over the 1 now. And Lily's mood is at 2 up to 3. It's been a week since the war had begun. Just a week. An entire week. Time seemed to have slowed down, and every new day that came seemed longer than the last. Deep inside, my fear was growing. Fear for myself, my family, my home, my country. Fear for the future. We heard bombs exploding outside and wondered if the next one would hit us, and if we survive it. The constant wait for death left us with neither energy nor willingness to do anything. All we did was keep checking the news. I didn't know what we wanted to see there. as good news were in short supply. Any new information served to distract us from the horrors around us. That's what we were doing, sitting in our basement when my phone rang. Me and Lily flinched from the sound. The happy melody our daughter picked for the ringtone sounded terribly out of place, sacrilegious even. It was David, our neighbor. Oleski, hide your phone. The Ruskies are going around town, taking them away. He hung up, and I quickly hid the phone under the floorboards. David's timing was impeccable. Upstairs in our house, we heard a loud crash and heavy footsteps. The Russians broke into our home. We turned off the light, leaving me and Lily in total darkness, and listened. Loyosha, what do we do? Lily whispered. I heard growing panic in her voice. In the dark, I found her hand and squeezed it. Let's be quiet. Maybe they'll leave us alone. We weren't so lucky. In a few moments, someone knocked on the basement door. It was a heavy sound. They must have been knocking with their rifles' butt. Open up, quick, or we're breaking down the door. I didn't want to let the Russians in, but I didn't want to antagonize armed men either. We had to turn on the lights and open the door. 3 Russian soldiers descended into the basement. They were armed and looked ready to use their weapons at the drop of a hat. Lily backed away from them, and so did I, using the wall for support. One of the soldiers noticed my limp. What's wrong with your leg, old man? He must have thought it was a combat wound. Hurts to step on it. An old injury. Spent half my life with a cane. He nodded and looked around the basement. We're searching the houses looking for Nazis and saboteurs. Do you know of any Nazis in the city? Now we're given 3 more options here. We give them a false lead. We could play dumb. Or we could tell them they're being lied to. Well, I wouldn't want to antagonize armed men, especially when I'm not armed. I have a family to worry about. So tell them they're being lied to is out of the question. We give them a false lead, they can come back and kill us. Playing dumb seems more of a safer bet, so let's play dumb. I tried to make up something, hoping they'd simply leave us alone. Sorry, we don't talk to our neighbors much. We wouldn't know any Nazis. As I spoke, I felt my hands starting to shake. I was too old for such stress. Then I thought about the Russians' reaction if they noticed it and thought I was lying. It only made matters worse. It got dark, but suddenly Lily came to my rescue. What are you doing? Can't you see? He's worried out of his mind. My husband is a hero of socialist labor. His father reached Berlin in 1945, and you're asking him about Nazis? The soldier looked at me, then at Lilia. Then he spit on the floor and commanded the rest to leave. I slid to the floor, down the basement wall. There was a ringing in my ears, and the room was spinning out of control. by my own heartbeat. I could barely hear Lily when she said, "Here, drink this, it should help." A few sips of cold water did bring me back to life. When my vision cleared up, I looked at Lily with gratitude. "Thank you, darling. What would I ever do without you?" Lily didn't say anything. She just smiled and squeezed my palm. I thought once again how lucky I was to have her having such a wife. No change in the parameters. Under fire. They were still fighting, but only on the outskirts. Lily had never gotten used to it, but I did. They were still fighting, was something I kept telling myself as I saw Russians rummage through the houses on our street. Primitive Chechens, Kardovites, as they are called, even dropped by our wreck of a house. There wasn't much to steal, but they stole it anyway. Me and Lily had enough sense not to argue, and so they just took what they wanted and left. Mizorzin's turn hadn't come yet, but they knew they would not be so lucky. That's why I couldn't refuse David when he asked that his daughter stay with us a few days. Me and Lily were just a tired old couple, and with my leg, I wasn't much of a threat. The Russians were done with us. So much, Oleski. Those people are monsters, David shared as Lily helped Melina make her way into our basement. Have you heard the word around town? Of course I had. The Russians took whatever they wanted. They ate anything that could be eaten, drank anything that could be drank, and took anything that could resell back home. I wasn't born yesterday. I expected as much. It was war, and I could accept it. But what they did to women, I refuse to accept. Are you sure you don't want to join us with Ola? We'll make room, I offered. He shook his head. No, Fedorovich. You just keep Melina hidden for a few days. Okay? Me and Ola will manage somehow. We'll keep real quiet. He put his finger on his lips and smiled. I smiled back at him. As he walked out onto the street, I waved goodbye. There was a pop, like a firecracker going off in the distance. David fell to the ground. He screamed. What I did next I could never be proud of. I threw myself towards the basement entrance and slammed the door shut. Downstairs, Lily yelped at the loud bang. My chest began to hurt, and I clutched it with one hand. A second distant pop. The screaming stopped. I think I waited for hours. Melina was downstairs, covering her mouth and looked in mute horror, looking with David's eyes. I think I waited for hours. When I finally peeked through the door, slow and careful, making no sound, there was David all right, and two Russians. One standing over David, another rifling through his pockets. "And what did you do that for?" The one standing asked. He sounded calm, bored even. "He was a Nazi. Can't you tell? I know them when I see them." The other shrugged in the dark. He was not being serious. I could hear him grin. They laughed, and they both lit themselves a cigarette. Closed the basement door and kept it closed throughout the night. Milena cried for hours. Lily held her hand and did her best not to cry too. But in the morning, she too joined in when she heard Olena's wailing outside. Ola's. In the morning, there was fighting on the outskirts again, but closer to us. Sometimes bullets whizzed through the air right above our fence. When I crawled through the door to the basement, Ola crawled towards us on all fours. But something had to be done about David. We're giving two options here. We can go get a shovel and try to give David a proper burial. Or I didn't want anybody to join David. Well, to be honest, don't know how many people of you value your friends and family as much as I do. I'm gonna go get a shovel. I'm gonna go get a shovel. Can't leave my friend like that. So I got a shovel and crawled towards David. As I dug a grave for him, I had to stop at least 24 times. The air would get so hot, the shots too loud, and the ground would shake so hard it knocked us all off our feet. In the end, it was barely a grave. David's broad Armenian shoulders barely fit in it. It seems like the earth itself refused to believe he was dead. But it had to be suffice. And while it was a little relief for the girls, we did David good. The dogs weren't going to get him. Aliska's mood was at 2, now we dropped down to 1. All our food was at 2, we dropped down to 1. Milena's mood was at 2, now we dropped down to 1. The 10th day of war, By the 10th day of war, our supplies were dwindling. Me and Lily always tried to manage with little excess, and had very little food stocked up. Why would we? The shops nearby had everything we needed. But now, there was twice as many of us. The migrants brought some of their own supplies with them, but it wasn't enough for 4 people. Someone had to get us some supplies. Lily didn't want me to go. They were still fighting in Hostomel. Every day we heard explosions, machine gun fire, and artillery barrages. My wife even wanted to go look for supplies by herself. But I managed to talk her out of it. If anybody was going to take such a risk, It had to be me. I told her the Russians wouldn't give me a second thought. There was no use in shooting an old cripple. It would just be a waste of ammo. I wasn't even a threat to them at all. I was trying to convince myself of this as much as her. Eventually, Lilia saw things my way and pretended she did. Ola and Milena talked very little in these last few days. David's death was heavy on them. With him gone, they were on their own. I had double responsibility now. Milena cried a lot, looking at the dark circles under her eyes. I thought David should have taken her to somewhere else, someone stronger and healthier. The gunfire outside had quieted down. I took my cane and grabbed my old backpack. Lily, stay quiet down here and keep everyone inside. I'll be back soon. I promise. I will see if there's anything useful nearby and be right back. She nodded, barely holding back her tears. After what happened to David, she feared for my life even more. It was quiet outside, and after the dark, damp basement, the sunlight was blinding. When my eyes did adjust to it, I wish they didn't. Many houses on our street were ruined, either heavily damaged or simply gone. The intact ones had all been broken into and looted. The Russians took everything: clothing, household appliances, tools, even children's toys. I couldn't understand what kind of person would do that. I saw ransacked cars everywhere. Many of them were missing their wheels. Some were shot or flattened by armored vehicles. Inside one such car, I saw someone's mangled remains. I looked away in horror and disgust. The streets were also full of bodies. People in civilian clothing were strewn about among the debris like broken dolls. I had no idea why they were killed. Were they in the wrong place at the wrong time, like David? Did they draw someone's anger? I refused to believe this was all happening on the streets of my hostomel. And yet, I still had a task to complete. I decided what to look for. We had a pressing need for many things, but with my leg, I could only manage a single purposeful trip. I guess our only option is medicine. We already have gas, and we already have alcohol. I kept thinking about David. If he survived, we'd have nothing to treat his wounds with, so I needed to get some medicine first. There was a pharmacy not far from our house. I decided to look there and check the abandoned houses along the way. Indeed, I managed to find some food and water there. Did that make me a looter? I hope not. I didn't want to think myself as one, so I made an effort to remember which things I took and where I could compensate my neighbors after the war. expected, the pharmacy had been ransacked. Shattered windows, racks turned over, and broken cash registers. The Russians had already liberated the place, and even threw themselves a little party, it seemed. On the floor, I saw empty bottles of ethanol. Eventually, I did find an unopened bottle of ethanol. It rolled under a rack, and I was the first one to find it. In the back, I found bandages and antibiotics. Thanking the Almighty for such a great luck, I packed everything into my backpack and hurried back home. As I walked back home, the fighting resumed, and judging by the sounds, it was headed my way. I sped up to the best of my ability. A few times, the explosions would ring out a single street away from me, making the ground shake under my feet. I wanted to drop the supplies I found and try to run, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't come back empty-handed. When I finally reached my home safely, I couldn't believe my luck. It was already getting dark outside. My leg was on fire. My back was killing me. But Lily's adoring gaze made up for any discomfort. Her look made me feel like a young man in his prime again. For the first time in forever, I felt useful. Now we have some medicine. The celebration. Mobile connection was down more than often than it was not. And even then, we had to go outside to catch any. But even so, the gossip spread quickly around Hostomel. The fighting had died down, and the Russians had the free run of the town. And that's when the news started coming in, news I didn't want to believe. People said a man was shot for not showing the Russians his phone. Another man did show them his, and the Russians shot him over something they found in it. Another man was shot for wearing camouflage pants. Another for asking the soldiers what they were doing in Ukraine. I didn't know what to think of it. I didn't want to believe it. Most of the soldiers in the village were barely adults. Yet those that shot David Mizron were barely adults too. And every night we heard more gunshots. And every night we heard women screaming. Milena was terrified. She kept beating herself up over heading to Hostomel before the war. Kyiv, we were told, was still holding out, but Hostomel, as we'd soon find out, Hostomel was lost. One evening, we sat huddled in the basement. Me and Ola, Lily, and Milena, who had hid in the farthest corner, fearing the worst. We were always ready to hide her under the blankets as if she wasn't there. And the Russians were rowdy that evening. Their gunfire and frenzied shouted echoed across the town. Suddenly, we heard someone bang on the door, and mere seconds later, it flew open. Milena hit herself immediately, and the rest of us jumped to our feet. We heard commotion coming from the upstairs, from someone's slow and messy descent. a Russian. When he stumbled into the basement, I recoiled from the stench of sweat and alcohol. He could barely stand as he looked at us. His sleepy blue eyes were almost white. "Good evening. So what's it gonna be?" He slurred, as if continuing a point he made before. "Somewhere upstairs, if not hours ago. Are there any girls left in this town?" My heart sank. Lily and Ola just blinked at each other. The man stood at the exit, trapping us inside. His rifle was at his shoulder, way out of our reach. Then he moved across the basement towards the bedding where Milena was hiding. My heart sank. Luckily, Lilia spoke up. "What are you celebrating?" I was baffled at first, but then I too put the dots together. The smell of alcohol and the shouts outside. The soldier was already barely standing when he came to us. As it turned out, that's why he went for the bedding, to land onto it with a loud, tired groan. I couldn't breathe from strain. Milena was barely a meter away from him, hidden under a pile of blankets. "We took Hostomel. Ha! We took everything up to Kyiv. It soon, your president." He grinned and drew his thumb across his dirt-caked neck. "Him and the rest of the fucking Nazis." We had to keep the boy distracted, to get him to leave us alone as soon as possible. We have 3 options. 2 options, really. So we kept him talking. So we got him more drunk. Let's get him more drunk. "Lyosha, did you hear that? They liberated Hostomel. Get our heroes something to drink." Lily didn't need to ask me twice, and though we took out 4 cups, the Russian got most of the alcohol. He did not insist, but he didn't protest either. The drink sedated him and loosened his tongue. And the stories he told us were awful. The boy didn't seem to come from a happy household, and his home village somewhere in North Russia was sparse of young women. He said he was conscripted a year ago, and it wasn't even supposed to be in Ukraine, but he was having the time of his life. "Take whatever you want, eat whatever you want, fuck local girls, shoot every once in a while, and then I go back and they'll give me a medal for it." He grinned. I wanted to strangle him. It lasted for so long, I was afraid Milena would suffocate under all those blankets. But she did well. She later told us that she was shaking the whole time. I didn't even notice. And soon, the Russian could barely string his words together. He leaned against the wall, and his rifle's belt started slipping from his shoulder. He barely even noticed. Just then, we heard someone else walk through the house, open basement door. Another Russian. He too was armed. "Servi, get the fuck out. Sarge is looking for you. What the fuck are you even doing here?" "Finding us some girls for the night, like yesterday. I told the fucking sergeant where I was going." The man got to his feet, grumbling under his breath. I winced at the crass exchange, but said nothing. This wasn't the time or place to tell youngsters to mind their language. Thankfully, the soldiers were about to leave anyway. Oh, leave these fat old hags alone, you idiot. We found someone younger. We did have alcohol, now we're at 0. Relentless mood is 1. Was at 1, now it's at 0. Lena loses hope. This event was caused by your previous actions. Conditions met. Lena mood 0. Now it's 0. Milena loses hope. Milena wasn't looking good. News were getting harder to come by, with everybody staying home and mobile connection failing us more often than not. But anytime we got the news, it was all worse than before. Lily and Ola could hardly calm her down. When they got together, they'd only magnify each other's fears. They all knew, if the Russians came for us, there would be hardly anything we could do about it. And even if I had a weapon, I was a tired old man. Nobody expected me to fight the entire Russian army. One night, we all woke up hearing Russian vehicles moving on the road above. Even after they passed us, Milena couldn't sleep. She was already afraid to move or even breathe. I had to distract her somehow. I talked to her all night. I settled in the corner next to Milena and tried to get her to talk. It was slow going at first, but I suppose I was non-threatening enough that she started to open up. She told me how much she hated the Russians and how much they took from her family already. She told me how much she missed her father, how when she was little, he tried his best to keep her from finding out about death. Whenever her pets disappeared, it was because they made some miraculous escape to the hamster land or rabbit land, wherever they'd be happier. She was right. David was a good man. I mean, he didn't deserve what happened to him, not one bit. When she cried, I hugged her and did my best not to join in. Eventually, Milena fell asleep. I covered her up with the best I could and tried to raise my feet, but couldn't. I had too little strength left in me. Eventually, I drifted to sleep on the floor. Next morning, my back was not thankful for it. In the end, I managed to shield Milena from this war a little bit, and that's what mattered. Well, this move was at 1, now we're at 0. Milena's move was at 0, now we're at 2. Oleski loses hope. Oleski loses hope. It took my hope a while to erode, but when it did, there was no going back. At first they promised that the war would last for 3 days, then a week, then until the next weekend. Then the Russians took Hostomel, and were already shelling Kyiv. Like David predicted, it was all going to be over soon, but not in the way that we expected. I just knew it. It would be the end with Zelensky's dead, and the population put through filtration camps, and there nobody would care if I'm a hero of socialist labor. Zelensky Borisov couldn't go on. Borisov family died with the city. Story has ended. May want to replay it to see a different outcome. Well, guys, that was our first playthrough. I wouldn't say playthrough, I would say reading. I really don't consider this a game. A game is supposed to bring entertainment. I believe this is supposed to bring awareness to everything that's going on. Like I said at the beginning of this playthrough, we're used to seeing the digital horrors, quote unquote, of the battlefield, running through the trenches, spraying the enemy, blah 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 blah. But we never get to see the other side of war, the other side of conflict, the civilian side, what the civilian goes through. So the two remaining stories in this from Starry Games, hope we get to understand a little bit more. I'm not really a big reader on things. I pretty much like to read it myself. I'm not pretty good at reading stuff out loud, but I'm gonna try, and we're gonna continue on. So join me next time. Later, guys.